Grace Holloway wasn't the kind of woman who made impulsive purchases. Her life, much like her writing, was deliberate and calculated. But when she stepped into the musty barn on the edge of Ashgrove and saw the vintage desk standing in a pool of dusty sunlight, something shifted. It was carved from dark mahogany, its legs curved like a ballerina's stance, poised yet solid. There were scratches along the edges, evidence of time's slow erosion, but the structure held firm, like it had endured something worth remembering. She had come to the auction out of boredom more than interest, a rainy Saturday in a new town where she knew no one, not even the barista who scribbled her name wrong on coffee cups. The auctioneer barely noticed her, until she raised her hand during the low bidding war for the desk. The crowd didn't care for writing furniture from the 1800s. Grace got it for $75. "Nice piece," the auctioneer said, as he helped her load it into the back of her SUV. "From the Sutton estate. House burned down years ago. Weird story, that one." Grace didn't ask. She just nodded, tracing the brass keyhole with her finger. It had no key. Later she'd wonder if it was meant to stay locked. Back home, she placed the desk by the front window of her rented Victorian, the only source of natural light in the house. It looked almost regal there, as if it had been waiting to reclaim its throne. She sat before it, hands hovering over the surface, letting her palms feel the slight ridges in the wood. The drawers opened with a slight resistance, the kind of sticky friction only age could provide, until she reached the last one on the left. It didn't budge. No matter how she pulled, it refused to give. Leaning closer, she noticed two small brass screws sealing it shut, not jammed. Not stuck. Deliberately screwed closed. Her brow furrowed. She grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer and returned, the air now heavier in the room. As she pressed the tool to the screw, something held her back. A subtle chill ran down her spine. She blinked. A shadow seemed to flicker across the wall, then vanish. Just a trick of light, she told herself. She didn't open it that day. Later that night, in bed, she thought about the desk, about why someone would seal a drawer shut like that, about what kind of secret was worth hiding for over a century. What if she wasn't meant to find it? What if whatever was inside didn't want to be found? Still, the writer in her couldn't resist a good mystery. She had moved to Ashgrove hoping for inspiration, for something beyond the sterile blandness of her apartment back in Boston. And maybe, just maybe, the desk had found her for a reason. There was something about it, the weight of history pressed into its grain, the sense that it had been waiting just like her. But before she could dive deeper into that mystery, let's pause for just a second. If stories like this send a chill down your spine, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales just like this one. Because what happens next? It's not just about what's inside that drawer. It's about what it awakens. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains, casting a gentle glow across the desk. Grace sat before it with a mug of black coffee, staring at the sealed drawer as if it might speak. It hadn't moved since yesterday. The screws still glinted, untouched. Her fingers twitched, tempted to try again, but something inside her warned to wait. She had come to Ashgrove for quiet. After months of numb grief and creative drought, she'd needed something unfamiliar. Her father's death had silenced the world around her, like snowfall smothering sound. The city had grown too loud with memories, too full of people who spoke in hushed tones and sideways glances. She had stopped answering emails. Deadlines came and went. Her agent was patient, but even patience has its limits. Ashgrove had offered her an escape. Her town of whispering pines and cobblestone paths, where the loudest sound was the distant call of seagulls and the occasional creak of an old house settling into its bones. She had found the rental online, a faded Victorian with ivy climbing the porch posts, paint peeling at the corners and floors that spoke with every step. It wasn't perfect, but it had potential. Like her. The desk felt like a sign, a gift, or maybe a challenge. She pulled open the top drawers again, checking for anything she might have missed. Old pencil shavings, a brittle strip of leather, the scent of aged paper. No hidden notes, no keys, no secret compartments. She tried to distract herself with work, opened her laptop. typed a few lines about a woman returning to her hometown after tragedy, then deleted them all. The words came thick, clumsy, forced. Her thoughts wandered back to the initials carved beneath the desk. MLS, 1901. The numbers had haunted her dreams last night, flickering like gaslight in the distance just out of reach. She closed the laptop. Grace wandered through the house, checking window locks, running her hand along the staircase banister. The rooms echoed with emptiness, the silence so deep it pressed on her eardrums. It wasn't an unfriendly silence, just watchful. Back in the front room, she sat in the worn armchair across from the desk, notebook in hand. She wrote, "Why would someone seal a drawer shut? What did they want to keep hidden, or keep safe?" The questions felt like bait. Her curiosity swelled, restless beneath the surface. She hadn't felt this alive in months. Maybe this desk was more than just wood and screws. Maybe it was a thread to follow, something to pull until the whole thing unraveled. Still, she waited. She told herself she'd wait one more day before opening it. She told herself there was no rush, but deep down she knew the truth. She didn't wait because of logic. She waited because of fear, not fear of the unknown, but of what the drawer might force her to remember. Loss, after all, wasn't just about what you couldn't find. It was about what you didn't want to. That night, she set her phone on the desk and recorded a voice memo, something she hadn't done in ages. "This is Grace Holloway," she said softly. "Day 2 in Ashgrove. The house is quiet. Too quiet. And the desk, I don't know. It feels like it's watching me." She stopped the recording, feeling a little silly, but not entirely. Her fingers lingered over the edge of the drawer again, cold, solid. Waiting. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rustling the trees. The house creaked. The smell of salt from the ocean rolled in through the cracked window. She went to bed early that night, but her thoughts did not sleep. By the third night, Grace began to feel it. It started subtly. A breeze that shouldn't have been there brushing against her ankles as she walked past the desk. The window was shut, the heater off. She told herself it was nothing, an old house breathing through its cracks. But the draft had weight, a presence that made her skin tighten. She tried to work, to lose herself in words. But each sentence she typed felt shallow. Her focus kept drifting back to that drawer, still sealed, still untouched, and yet it loomed. At dusk, as the sky bruised purple, she heard it for the first time, a soft tapping, like knuckles against wood, not loud, not even clear, but undeniably real. She paused, staring at the ceiling, waited, silence, then the tapping again, 3 slow knocks. She stood, heart kicking, and walked the perimeter of the house, checked the front door, the back, the basement hatch. Nothing, no wind. No trees against the siding, just silence. But when she returned to the front room, the air felt cooler. The tapping had stopped. The desk sat quiet and still, as if it had never moved. Grace leaned down and studied the drawer again. The screws were aged, one of them rusted and slightly bent. She tried the screwdriver once more. The right one turned halfway before sticking. The left wouldn't budge at all. She examined the wood around it. Near the corner, almost invisible in the grain, were faint initials, MLS. She'd seen them before, but now they pulsed in her memory like a warning. Below the letters, etched delicately, was a date. 1901. Her breath caught. The auctioneer had mentioned the Sutton estate. Could that be the same? She grabbed her phone, typed the initials into a search bar, and scrolled through local records. Nothing immediately jumped out. She made a note to dig deeper. Later that evening, while brushing her teeth, she caught movement in the mirror. A quick flicker behind her, like someone turning. She spun around. The hallway was empty. The lights didn't flicker. But her hands trembled as she gripped the sink. The night dragged. Sleep came in fragments. When she finally drifted off, the dream was vivid and sharp. She stood in a room lit by gaslight, watching a woman in a high-collared dress write frantically at a desk. The same desk. The woman's hair was pinned in a tight bun, her face pale, hands trembling. She paused, turned her head as if sensing Grace, and then whispered something. "Don't open it." Grace woke gasping, drenched in sweat, her sheets tangled around her legs. The whisper echoed in her mind like a bell struck underwater. She got up, went to the front room, and sat in the armchair, staring at the desk through the half-light of dawn. The drawer, still closed, looked utterly ordinary. Harmless, just wood, brass, and time. But now she knew something was wrong. She pressed her hand to the top of the desk, feeling the cool grain. Something vibrated beneath her palm, not literally, but deep, like a memory stirring. She whispered, "Who are you?" No answer came, only the slow creak of the house settling, and the soft scrape of a drawer shifting slightly, just enough to let her know it was still there, still waiting. The next morning, Grace stood in front of the Ashgrove Historical Society, a modest brick building tucked between a shuttered bakery and an old hardware store. A hand-painted sign swung gently above the door. Inside, the air smelled of old books and lemon polish, the kind of scent that clings to memory. The woman at the front desk looked up from her crossword. "Can I help you?" Grace hesitated, then offered a polite smile. "I'm researching a piece of furniture I bought at the estate auction last week, from the Sutton property." The woman's pen paused mid-air. "The Margaret Sutton estate?" "I think so. The initials on the desk are MLS dated 1901. The woman leaned back, her face folding into lines of recognition. "You've got one of Margaret's desks?" "That's rare. Most of her things were lost in the fire. People around here still talk about her." "Who was she?" The woman gestured toward a back room. "You'll want the archives. Everything we've got on Margaret is in there. She was complicated." Grace found herself flipping through brittle folders in a dimly lit reading room, surrounded by silence and the hum of a dehumidifier. The deeper she dug, the stranger the story became. Margaret Lydia Sutton, born 1873, Ashgrove native, talented writer, a few short stories published in literary journals out of Boston, known locally as reclusive, private, lived alone in a large Victorian inherited from her grandfather, no children, never married. She disappeared in the spring of 1901. The last record was a letter she wrote to the Ashgrove Chronicle, a rambling, paranoid piece never published. The letter was preserved in a folder marked Unverified Accounts. Its ink was faded, the cursive elegant but frantic. She wrote about being watched, about secrets buried in oak and ink. She claimed she'd discovered something she wasn't meant to. There were vague references to a presence and a circle of silence. Grace read the words aloud softly. "If I vanish, let this be my record. The truth is hidden where the last story ends." A note from the archivist had been scrawled in pencil beside it, likely a result of isolation-induced hysteria. No evidence of foul play. There was one more article in the folder, a clipping from 1903. Headline: Ashgrove author still missing after 2 years. A photograph accompanied it. Margaret, seated stiffly in front of the same desk Grace now owned. Her eyes were intense, jaw set, as if daring the camera to blink first. Grace stared at the image for a long time. Later, she thanked the woman at the front and walked back into the afternoon sun, her mind buzzing. Back at home, she sat once again at the desk, ran her hand along the edge where Margaret's fingers once rested. That photograph wouldn't leave her thoughts. Neither would the letter. What had Margaret discovered? What story had she never finished? The drawer, of course, remained shut, unyielding, but now it felt less like a mystery and more like a message. Grace whispered, "I'm listening." The room answered with silence, deep and endless. And yet, something had changed. Not in the desk, in her. She no longer felt like the stranger. She felt like she'd stepped into a story already begun, one waiting patiently for the next line. It took nearly an hour of steady effort, but the screw finally gave. Grace had waited long enough. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled open the drawer, expecting resistance, but it slid out with an almost eager ease, revealing its contents as if it had been holding its breath for over a century. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in delicate oilskin. The material crackled as she unfolded it, revealing 3 items: A stack of yellowed letters tied with twine, a fragile, dried violet flower pressed between 2 pages, and a small black notebook bound in leather. The air around the drawer felt colder than the rest of the room. She reached for the top letter, noting how carefully it had been addressed, "To the woman who finds this." Grace's heart thudded once. The handwriting was looping, elegant but sharp at the edges, the way someone writes when fear tightens the fingers. She unfolded the page and began to read. "If you are reading this, then I have failed. Or perhaps I've succeeded, in some way I cannot understand. Either way, I am gone and you are in danger. My name is Margaret Lydia Sutton. I was born in this town and I will likely die here, but not in a way you might expect. The thing that watches, that waits. I've seen it. I've written of it. I've tried to warn others, but words on paper are no match for silence enforced by fear." Grace swallowed, the words pressing into her like cold hands. "He calls himself the Collector, not by name, but by nature. He finds those who remember what others have tried to forget. He comes when the truth edges too close to the surface. I thought I was clever. I thought I could write my way out. But I was wrong. He does not forgive. He does not sleep." Grace paused, her fingers trembling against the brittle edge of the letter. Her breath felt shallow. The world outside her window faded into stillness. She read on. "The desk you found, it is a vessel, a tomb. I locked this drawer not to protect myself, but to protect whoever came after. You, most likely. You're a woman, curious, alone, drawn to stories like moths to flame. If you found this, then perhaps you are brave enough to finish what I began. Or perhaps you are foolish enough to try. Either way, you must understand, what you've awakened cannot be ignored. Do not speak his name aloud. Do not share these words carelessly. And whatever you do not burn the notebook." Grace looked at the black leather book. It was warm to the touch, unnervingly so. Her fingers recoiled before she forced them to open it. The pages were filled with dense handwriting, entries dated from January through April of 1901. The ink grew increasingly erratic, lines slanting, margins shrinking. A woman unraveling, or documenting something she couldn't fully explain. One final sentence stood alone on the last page. "He lives in silence, but the drawer remembers." Grace stared at it, the words seared into her mind. She gathered the letters, retied them with the twine, and set them aside with reverent care. The dried violet remained where it was, delicate, brittle, ancient. She leaned back in her chair, her breath shaky, her mind whirling. The mystery had deepened, but it wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about something older, darker, something that knew how to wait. And now it knew Grace was reading. Grace spent the entire night reading. Margaret's journal was more than a diary. It was a descent. The early entries detailed her daily routines, her frustrations with publishing, the loneliness that clung to her like fog. But woven between those mundane notes were hints of something else, something creeping. January 3rd, 1901. The man in the grey coat was outside again. He never knocks, never speaks, just waits. January 18th. I heard footsteps upstairs last night. I live alone. February 2nd. The dreams have begun. Always the same. A mouth with no face, whispering my name in a voice that isn't human. Grace turned each page slowly, carefully, afraid to miss anything, or to see too much. By mid-February, the tone shifted. Margaret became obsessed with patterns, with hidden meanings in old texts, church carvings, town records. She wrote about symbols repeating, particularly one she kept finding, a triangle inside a circle. She called it the Mark of the Silent. February 19th. He follows those who ask too many questions. He doesn't kill, he erases. Like blotting out a word from history. You'll remember nothing except that something is missing. Grace paused, staring at the sentence. Something about it burrowed beneath her skin. She returned to the desk and began examining every surface, the edges, the underside. She remembered the initials, Emma Lesson, and the date, but there was something else she hadn't seen before. On the bottom of the drawer she had opened, Carved faintly into the wood was that very symbol, a triangle inside a circle, barely visible, hidden beneath years of dust. Her pulse quickened. She took a photo and compared it to the sketch Margaret had drawn in the journal. It was identical. The entries from March were more erratic. Margaret mentioned trying to warn others, but people avoided her. She wrote of eyes watching her from mirrors, voices echoing through the house when she was alone. Her handwriting deteriorated, letters leaning sideways like they were falling. March 12th. They came into the house, not through the door, through the cracks in the walls, through silence itself. March 21st. There is a place beneath language where he waits. Not darkness, not shadow. Silence given shape. By the end of the journal, Margaret wasn't sleeping. She began to talk to someone she called the listener, someone who answered questions she never asked aloud. Grace didn't know if this was madness or revelation, maybe both. One final note was scrawled at the edge of a torn page. If you want to know more, look behind the story. There are truths the ink can't carry. It made no sense at first, but Grace kept reading those words over and over until her mind caught something. Look behind the story. She took a flashlight, turned off the desk lamp, and angled the light across the pages of the journal, watching for inconsistencies. On a few, the ink shimmered oddly. She flipped to the back of the notebook and noticed the cover's inner lining was loose. Peeling it back, she found a folded paper, brittle and stained, with writing in lemon juice. She held it close to the bulb's heat, and the words appeared slowly, ghost-like. He collects not objects, but memories. He binds silence into wood. And the desk is his altar. Grace stepped back, her skin crawling. The journal wasn't just a warning. It was a map. And someone, or something, didn't want it read. The symbol wouldn't leave her mind. Triangle inside a circle. Margaret had seen it. Grace had seen it. And now it was appearing everywhere she turned. She flipped through the journal again, tracing every instance where Margaret had drawn it, noting where it was found. Carved on an attic beam in the corner of an old church pew on the base of a town monument no one ever visited. It wasn't just decoration, it was a mark, a warning, or maybe an invitation. That afternoon, Grace searched the house from top to bottom. She opened every closet, checked behind every frame, ran her fingers along the seams of every window pane. The old place creaked under her movements, like it resented being disturbed. But she couldn't stop. The journal had shifted something in her, not just curiosity, but a kind of compulsion. She found nothing on the first floor. The second gave her chills, cold spots in the hallway, a sense that someone had just stepped around a corner out of sight. But no symbols. Then she went to the attic. The air was stale and dry, thick with dust motes dancing in the dim light from a single gabled window. Old trunks lined the walls, forgotten things sealed away by previous tenants. Grace climbed the narrow stairs with a flashlight, her feet stirring up the scent of old wood and insulation. She scanned the rafters first, then the floorboards, and then, just above the frame of the small attic door, she saw it, the same symbol, etched deeply into the wood. Not old and weathered, but recent, as if carved with precision. No dust inside the grooves. Grace ran her thumb across it. The edges were clean, sharp. She backed away, unease swelling in her chest. Just below the symbol, the wall seemed wrong. The paneling didn't match. One plank jutted slightly outward. She pressed her fingers to it. Nothing moved. Then she remembered Margaret's words. Look behind the story. She retrieved a small crowbar from the tool chest in the hallway closet and returned to the attic. Her hands shook slightly, but she dug into the seam and pried gently. The wood gave with a creak, revealing a narrow space behind the wall, a hidden cavity. Inside was a small alcove lined with rotted cloth, and at the center sat an old photograph in a wooden frame cracked with age. Grace brushed off the dust. It showed a group of 6 people in early 1900s dress, standing in front of what looked like a library. All of them bore solemn expressions. One figure stood slightly apart, his face obscured by shadow or degradation. Only a faint silhouette remained, but even in that, Grace felt the outline carried menace. Below the image was a faded handwritten caption, "Circle of Silence, Ashgrove, 1899. She pulled the photograph out and noticed something taped to the back, a folded slip of parchment. On it, a name, Edgar Linden. Beneath it, Ashgrove Historical Society, Director 1900-1901. Grace's breath caught. She knew that name. She had seen it earlier in the historical records, mentioned in passing. But she hadn't connected him to this. She slipped the photo and parchment into a notebook and closed the wall panel carefully. Back downstairs, she laid everything out on the desk. The journal, the letters, the photograph. Each piece a thread, pulling her deeper into something Margaret had only begun to uncover. The desk wasn't just a relic, it was a gate. And now she had stepped through. Grace couldn't shake the weight of the photograph. The circle of silence when 6 members, one obscured. Edgar Linden's name pinned behind the frame like a forgotten accusation. Director of the Ashgrove Historical Society, right before Margaret vanished. Everything about it pulsed with eerie symmetry. She hadn't expected the desk to lead her here, to dusty photographs, coded warnings, and the creeping certainty that something old and organized had existed beneath the polite fabric of Ashgrove. The attic, now disturbed, called to her again. Grace returned with a sharper flashlight and gloves. This time she examined every seam in the false wall. A knock against the far left plank gave back a hollow thud. She pressed her hand flat, felt air leaking through a hairline gap. The panel shifted under pressure, hinged, not nailed. It opened into darkness. A crawl space stretched before her, barely wide enough to move through. She hesitated only a moment before sliding in, dragging her flashlight ahead. The air inside was thick, stale, and metallic. She crawled 10 feet before the space widened slightly, and there, tucked behind beams and insulation, she found it, a secret room no larger than a closet. The walls were lined with yellowing newspaper clippings and black and white photographs, most curling at the corners with age. In the center, laid carefully on a draped trunk, sat a stack of pages bound with a crimson ribbon, an unfinished manuscript. The first page read, "When language fails, memory endures. A story silenced is not a story destroyed, only delayed." Below the line, Margaret L. Sutton, 1901. Grace's hands trembled as she picked up the manuscript. The pages were covered in tight cursive, more deliberate than the journal, as if Margaret had poured her final energy into every word. Grace flipped through, noting chapter titles like "The Veil of Memory," "Whispers in the Grain," and "The Collector's Tongue." It wasn't fiction, it was a testimony. It was a... Around the manuscript she noticed more photographs, snapshots of Margaret, her house, and oddly, familiar places in Ashgrove. One photo caught her breath, the very room where she now sat, though much older, furnished differently but unmistakable. The desk was in the same place. Another image showed the symbol again, triangle inside a circle, carved above an arched doorway. Margaret had drawn a red X over it. Grace looked up. The ceiling above her head was cracked, bowed inward from time. A single nail jutted down. Hanging from it by a thread was a small brass pendant in the shape of the symbol. She reached for it but didn't touch. Instead, she took the manuscript, folded it gently, and backed out of the space. Back in her living room, she laid everything out. Photographs, notes, Margaret's final story. It was overwhelming, surreal, but undeniably real. This wasn't a haunted desk. It was an artifact, a breadcrumb in a trail that had nearly been lost. She began reading the manuscript aloud, her voice steady, her breath short. The words were sharp, focused. Margaret described dreams shared across generations, a presence that seeped through forgotten corners, and a group who learned to worship silence as a god. She called them keepers of the unspoken, guardians of things that couldn't be unlearned. Grace paused. If Margaret had been silenced for trying to speak, then the truth must be dangerous. And if the manuscript had survived, If it had been hidden this well, then someone still didn't want it found. She looked again at the name, Edgar Linden. She had a new direction, and perhaps a new enemy. The days blurred after that. Grace found herself caught in a strange rhythm, waking, reading, pausing to listen for sounds she could no longer dismiss as ordinary. The manuscript had taken root in her mind. Even when she wasn't reading it, she felt its presence like a voice murmuring just beneath the threshold of hearing. She stopped answering calls. Her email inbox grew stale. The world beyond Ashgrove faded into silence. The only thing that mattered now was the truth Margaret had hidden and the figure at its center. The collector. Then the hallucinations began. They weren't like dreams. They arrived abruptly, vivid and sharp, layered over reality like water spilled across old ink. One moment she was in her kitchen making tea. The next, the walls around her shifted. Wallpaper peeling back into another era, gaslights flickering in place of LEDs, and a woman in a high-collared dress screaming silently in the hallway. Margaret. Grace blinked, and the present returned, leaving her knees weak and breath shallow. At first, she thought she was losing her grip. Sleep deprivation, isolation, too much time spent inside old words. But then it happened again and again, always near the desk, always when her mind drifted into that in-between state of thought and memory. The most intense vision came one evening as rain tapped the windows. She was sitting at the desk, fingers tracing the grain, when the room seemed to exhale. The air thickened, the lights dimmed, and suddenly she wasn't alone. She saw Margaret again, but this time clearer. She stood across the room, her eyes hollow, dress soaked, journal clutched to her chest. She didn't speak, but her lips moved. Grace couldn't hear the words, but she could feel their meaning. Stop digging. The next moment Margaret vanished, leaving behind the sharp scent of smoke and something colder, older. Grace staggered back, gasping, the manuscript falling to the floor. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, but the page had changed. She swore it hadn't been there before. You cannot expose what was buried in silence without becoming part of it. She flipped to the previous page. Nothing. Then back again. The message was gone. The desk groaned faintly, wood shifting like it remembered something. That night, she recorded another voice memo, a whisper barely audible over the rain. I think she's warning me. But I don't know if it's about the desk or about him. Later, as she drifted toward uneasy sleep, she dreamed of a mouth with no face, whispering her name in voices not her own. Grace, Grace, Grace. She woke with blood in her nose and a thin scratch on her forearm, a shallow line in the shape of a triangle inside a circle. It hadn't been there the night before. She stood in front of the mirror for a long time, staring at the mark. It didn't hurt, but it pulsed. A low vibration just beneath the skin, like it had been branded from within. She wrapped it with gauze and went back to the living room. The manuscript waited on the desk, the journal beside it. Her laptop blinked with a low battery warning. She hadn't opened it in days. Grace scribbled in her notebook, "Am I still following the trail, or am I now part of it?" She didn't know, but she couldn't stop. Something had awakened, not just in the house or the history, but in her. And if Margaret was right, silence was no longer her shield. It was her mirror. It started with a knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door, just past twilight. Grace paused mid-sentence, pen frozen above the page. No one ever came to her house uninvited. Not in Ashgrove. Not at this hour. She opened the door cautiously. A man stood on the porch, tall and angular, with a grey wool coat buttoned to the collar and dark gloves hiding his hands. His eyes were pale, not blue, not grey, but something in between, like frost catching moonlight. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Holloway," he said, voice smooth and polite. "May I have a word?" Her throat tightened. He didn't say how he knew her name. "I'm not taking visitors," she replied, but he remained still, patient. "I represent a historical interest. We understand you've come into possession of a rather significant artifact." A desk. From the Sutton estate. Grace didn't answer. Her mind spun. No one but the auctioneer knew where it had ended up. No one but her. "You've read it, haven't you?" he asked. "The journal. The manuscript." She closed the door halfway, but not fast enough. "I believe it's time you handed those over, for safekeeping." There was no malice in his tone, only certainty. As though he weren't asking, but reclaiming something already his. "What's your name?" she asked. The man tilted his head slightly. "Mr. Linden." The air drained from her lungs. "Edgar Linden, director of the Ashgrove Historical Society in 1901. "You're not—" she began, but the words felt stupid. He smiled again. "Names endure. People adapt." Grace tightened her grip on the door. "I'm keeping what I found." For a moment his face didn't move, then he sighed softly as if disappointed. "Miss Holloway," he said, "the collector does not destroy. He preserves. He catalogues what must not be spread. You've touched a thread that connects to very old things, things held in trust by those who understand the cost of speaking." "I won't be silenced," she snapped. "You already are," he said gently. "You've stopped answering calls, abandoned your deadlines. You've withdrawn into silence by your own hand. It only deepens from here." He stepped back, then reached into his coat and handed her a small card. It was ivory, unmarked except for the symbol, triangle within a circle, and a single word. "Remember." "Think carefully," he said. Truth without context becomes obsession. Obsession becomes isolation, and isolation, as you've seen, invites him. He turned and walked down the path, disappearing into the fog that had crept in from the ocean. Grace didn't move. Her heart thundered. Her hand shook as she locked the door. She stared at the card. It was warm. Later that night, she searched the town records again. Edgar Linden had died in 1902, drowned off the coast under mysterious circumstances. No family, no known associates. But his name appeared again and again in marginal notes from other towns, New Hampshire, Vermont, Nova Scotia. Each time tied to missing persons, each time associated with rare books, private auctions, estate sales. The trail spanned decades, centuries. She realized something Margaret had hinted at, but never said plainly. The collector wasn't just a person, he was a role. A title passed down, or assumed, by those who protected something larger than themselves. And Mr. Linden was just the latest name, worn by a face she'd now seen too clearly. He knew where she lived. He'd asked for the journal. Next time he might not ask. Grace pulled the curtains closed and turned every lock. Then she gathered the journal, the manuscript, and the letters, hiding them inside the old trunk she'd found in the attic. Whatever happened next, she would not back down. She would not give him the silence he craved, not without a fight. The manuscript had always felt heavy. Now Grace understood why. She read through it again, line by line, page by page, looking not just for what Margaret wrote, but for what she left unsaid. The coded phrasing, the repetitions, the breaks in rhythm that didn't match the cadence of her earlier writing. That's when Grace saw it. Certain letters capitalized mid-sentence, not for emphasis, not for grammar. Scattered seemingly at random, but only in the second half of the manuscript. She transcribed them one by one, pages spread out across the floor. The message emerged slowly. They took her, but not just her. We are many, bound by silence. Find the ledger. He hides their names there. The ledger. Grace scrambled back to the hidden attic space. She dug through the boxes again, pulling aside fabric and crumbling envelopes until she found it. A thick, dusty, leather-bound book with no title, tucked between a false bottom in the trunk. She opened it. Inside were names, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, written in 2 columns, the left side bearing names of women, all first and last, and the right side bearing dates spanning over a century. Next to some dates was a final mark, a small circle with a diagonal line through it. She scanned for Margaret's name, found it. Margaret L. Sutton, April 1901, marked. Her finger hovered over the line. The same month she disappeared. She read down further. Her heart clenched. There near the end, Grace Holloway, March 2025, unmarked. The breath left her lungs. She backed away from the ledger as if it had burned her. It hadn't been updated digitally. It wasn't some online database. This had been handwritten, page after page, across generations. If her name was in it, it meant someone, maybe Mr. Linden, had known she'd come here, or made sure she did. This wasn't coincidence, it was succession. She looked again at the earlier names. Women from places as distant as Salem, Amherst, Montreal, Belfast, most from small towns, solitary types, writers, historians, librarians, women drawn to silence, and then erased by it. Grace stood in the attic's half-light, heart racing, trying to decide if what she held was evidence or prophecy. She took photos of the entire ledger, page by page, her hands moving quickly now, instinctively. If she disappeared, someone had to find these. She returned to her laptop, opened a new document and began typing. Names, dates, cross-references. She searched newspaper archives, obituaries, missing persons reports. It all matched. These women had vanished, some after claiming to see things, others after leaving behind cryptic letters. Not one of them was ever found. The pattern was undeniable. She looked at the journal again, Margaret's voice clearer now. The warnings hadn't been paranoia, they were legacy, instructions, a breadcrumb trail left in desperation. Grace wrote through the night, fingers stiff, eyes burning. She wrote not as an observer, but as someone now fully inside the story. She was no longer a seeker, she was a witness. Before dawn, she printed everything, stuffed the documents into a padded envelope, and addressed it to her former editor in New York. If something happened to her, she needed someone to have it. She walked to the post office as the sun broke the horizon and dropped it in the outgoing mail slot. Her hand lingered a moment as if saying goodbye to part of herself. Back home, she returned to the ledger one last time. She noticed something strange. One name had been smudged, ink blurred, as if erased by water or sweat. She leaned closer, trying to decipher the letters, and as she stared, a whisper formed in her mind, not heard but felt. He knows. It happened the following night. Grace had fallen asleep at her desk, the manuscript open beneath her cheek, the pages warm from her breath. She didn't remember dozing off. One moment she was reading Margaret's final entry, something about soundless footsteps and a room that breathed, and the next she woke to silence too complete to be natural. The house wasn't just quiet, it was emptied of sound, no wind, no creaking. No fridge hum, no outside cars, as if everything had been paused. She rose slowly, the sense of being watched wrapping around her like a cold scarf. The first thing she noticed was the front door, slightly ajar. She knew she'd locked it. Grace moved through the house, checking each room. Nothing appeared disturbed, but something had shifted. A subtle wrongness. Like a breath taken and never released. Then she reached the living room. The journal was gone. She froze. The manuscript was still there, half buried under scattered notes. But Margaret's black leather journal, the one that had started everything, was missing. Vanished, though no windows were broken, no drawers emptied. Her laptop was untouched. The photographs, the coded messages, even the ledger remained in place, just the journal. It had been taken cleanly, precisely. Panic surged in her throat, sharp and acrid. She checked the attic space. No signs of entry. She opened the trunk, lifted the floorboards beneath the desk, even peeked behind the bookshelves. Nothing. She turned back to the front door, stepping outside into the dense fog that had crept across the lawn like spilled milk. The street was deserted. Lamps glowed faintly behind drawn curtains. No footsteps, no tire tracks, no proof anyone had been there, except for the absence, the void where the journal had been. Grace returned inside and locked everything again, deadbolts, chains, every window latch. Then she sat on the floor, heart thudding, and tried to piece together what this meant. Someone had entered her home. Someone had known exactly what to take. They hadn't wanted to destroy everything, only that one piece, the most personal part of Margaret's voice. The journal she'd written with trembling hands as her mind unraveled. the part that told the story not with facts, but with fear. Whoever had taken it didn't want the manuscript erased. They wanted it reframed. Truth rewritten. The theft wasn't a silencing. It was a redirection. Grace pulled the manuscript closer. Now it felt exposed, like a beacon. Whoever had come could easily return. And next time, they might not be so selective. She reached for her phone. No signal, Wi-Fi down, router blinking. No messages sent. It wasn't random. She scribbled everything in a notebook. The time she'd fallen asleep, the position of the door, the exact last page she remembered reading. Anything that could later be turned into evidence, if anyone ever believed her. She knew now she wasn't just a reader of Margaret's story. She was a participant in its continuation. The next morning, Grace drove to a nearby cafe with public internet and sent every digital file she had, the photos, transcriptions, notes, scanned pages, to multiple email accounts including a cloud backup and her former editor. She titled the folder, "If I Disappear." It was a precaution. But not paranoia, because something was closing in now, not slowly but deliberately, a tightening circle. Grace had drawn too close to the truth, and those who kept it buried were no longer watching from afar. They were inside the walls. Grace drove out of Ashgrove before sunrise. She didn't pack, she didn't leave a note. She only brought the manuscript, the ledger, and the envelope of photographs, and a single name scribbled on a napkin, Thomas Ridge. A retired FBI agent, long since vanished from headlines, known for investigating fringe disappearances tied to historical relics and secret societies. He now lived alone in a cabin deep in Vermont, if the address Grace found was still accurate. It was her only lead. 4 hours later, she knocked on his door. Ridge answered in flannel and silence, a man carved out of suspicion and regret. He eyed the folder in her hand and the urgency on her face, then stepped aside without a word. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and wood smoke. Books were stacked in towers against the walls, clippings, maps, red yarn crisscrossing pinned photographs. She wasn't the first to come looking. She laid the items on his table. He didn't ask questions at first, just read, scanned, flipped pages with careful fingers. Then he said, "You found Sutton's desk." Grace nodded. "She wrote about him," he continued, almost to himself. "More than most ever dared." "Who is he?" she asked. Ridge looked at her, something like pity behind his eyes. "There is no single he. The collector isn't a man, it's a mask worn by many, a role passed down like an inheritance or a curse." Grace leaned in. "What are they collecting?" "Truth, secrets, but not to expose, to erase." He reached for an old binder and pulled out a photograph of a man nearly identical to the Mr. Lyndon Grace had met. Same eyes, same posture, dated 1967. Another marked 1984. 2008. Slight changes, same face, same presence. "They remove stories that threaten the veil," Ridge said. "The illusion that history is linear, stable, but it's not. It's a fragile web, held in place by omission." Grace's pulse raced. And the women? Chosen for what they see, what they remember. Writers, witnesses, they get too close, and then they disappear. She showed him the ledger. Ridge's face darkened. "I've seen copies, never the original." He flipped to her name, paused. "They've marked you, but not finalized. That means you still have time." "Time for what?" she whispered. "To break the cycle." He handed back the manuscript. "You have Margaret's voice. That's more dangerous to them than you know. The truth isn't in the facts, it's in the fear. If you share her story, truly share it, not just as history but as warning, you fracture the control they've maintained." Grace swallowed. "So I publish it?" "You survive it first," he said grimly. "They won't stop with a warning next time." She nodded, standing slowly, brain firing in too many directions. As she turned to leave, Ridge stopped her. "Grace," he said, voice low. "There's something else." He handed her a grainy black-and-white photo from 1924, a group of men standing beside a burned-out house, One of them, unmistakably, was Mr. Linden. But that's... Yes, and look at this. He pulled out a photo from 2015, a lecture at a small university, guest speaker on esoteric archiving practices. The man at the podium wore a dark suit, slightly older, clean-shaven. But the eyes were the same. "He's not just a guardian of silence," Ridge said. "He's its vessel." Grace drove back to Ashgrove as twilight settled in, the sky bruised and full of threat. The truth wasn't a puzzle anymore. It was a warning written in centuries of silence. And now that she knew there was no turning back, Grace didn't sleep when she returned to Ashgrove. The house felt different now, not haunted but alert, as if it had been waiting for her decision, as if it already knew what she planned to do. She placed the manuscript on the desk, the ledger beside it, and opened her laptop. Her fingers moved fast. She began typing. An article, a confession, a story. She titled it, "The Drawer That Was Never Meant to Open." It wasn't an exposé. It wasn't journalism. It was a reckoning. She wrote for hours, pouring in Margaret's voice, her own nightmares, the names in the ledger, the warnings from Ridge. She didn't try to make it believable. She just made it true. Then she uploaded the file. Multiple servers, backups, scheduled emails. She posted excerpts on public forums, obscure websites, hidden boards. She included photos. Transcriptions. The symbol. Then she waited. By nightfall her hands had stopped shaking. That's when the knock came. She opened the door slowly. Mr. Linden stood in the same place, same coat, same stillness. But this time there was no smile, only disappointment. "You did it," he said. "I did. You understand the consequences?" Grace nodded. "Do you?" He stepped inside uninvited, eyes scanning the room like a librarian returning to find his archive in disarray. "You think exposure creates freedom," he said quietly. "But freedom invites chaos. When silence is broken, it doesn't bring clarity. It invites noise." "You mean truth," she said. "No," he replied. "I mean confusion, fear. You mistake knowledge for safety." But some knowledge was never meant for daylight. She didn't flinch. "I've read the manuscript," she said, "all of it. Margaret saw through the veil. You erased her. But you didn't stop her." "You call this survival?" he asked. "You've fractured your world. You'll be isolated, ridiculed, labeled delusional. I'd rather be called mad than be owned by your silence." He studied her. A long moment passed. Then he said, "You are not the first to defy us." "No," she said, "but I might be the first to finish it." From her pocket, she pulled out a USB stick and dropped it on the table. "If anything happens to me, it goes everywhere." He stared at it. Behind him the house creaked, low and deep. The air tightened, the room's temperature dropping like pressure before a storm. He stepped forward, and she hit record. On her phone, her backup recorder, her laptop webcam, everything. "You'll be erased," he said, voice nearly a whisper now. "But not alone," she answered. Outside, headlights appeared in the driveway. Grace didn't turn. A knock at the back door, then another. She had made calls. She had warned people. Ridge had contacted others, old contacts, journalists, law enforcement with clearance and a healthy sense of paranoia. The circle was no longer closed. It was breaking. Mr. Linden stepped back, face unreadable. "You've made a mistake," he said. "No," Grace said. "You made the mistake. You taught a writer how to speak in silence." He looked down at the manuscript, the ledger, the evidence spread before him. Then he turned and walked out without another word. By the time the officers entered through the back, the street was empty. No sign of him, no footprints, no vehicle. Only the smell of old paper and the taste of finality in the air. Grace handed them the documents, the recordings, the names, everything. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She just exhaled, the first real breath in days. Because now, it wasn't just her burden. It was a story the world could no longer ignore. In the weeks that followed, Ashgrove felt different. The town's silence, once oppressive, became a backdrop for whispers and questions. The police investigation unfolded quietly, but not invisibly. Grace watched from her window as officers came and went, carrying out boxes of evidence. The local news ran cautious headlines about historic mysteries and long-buried secrets coming to light. But those who had read her article online, the one she published under her own name, refusing to hide, already understood the real story. She received messages from strangers, survivors, daughters and granddaughters of women whose names had appeared in the ledger. They shared fragments of dreams, memories, and warnings passed down like family recipes. Some thanked her, some begged her to stop, some just needed to know they weren't alone. Grace replied to every message one by one, refusing the silence that had haunted so many for so long. She kept the desk. Police had offered to take it for further study, but she declined. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. It was just wood now, stripped of its secrets. Margaret's manuscript, the ledger, and all the documents were handed over to authorities and journalists. No more hiding. No more drawers sealed shut. Sometimes late at night she heard echoes, creaks, distant knocks, but they were no longer threats, just the house settling, or perhaps old stories folding themselves closed at last. She returned to her writing, not about ghosts or cults, but about survival, about the power of naming things and refusing to let fear dictate the end of a story. Her words carried Margaret's spirit, and the spirits of all those women, into the open where silence could no longer claim them. The article, "The Drawer That Was Never Meant to Open," spread quickly. It didn't solve every mystery. It didn't erase the pain of the past, but it broke the cycle. People read, people listened, people remembered. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a law firm in Boston. Margaret's only known heir, a great-niece Grace had never met, wanted to thank her. She'd never known the truth about her aunt. Now she would. Grace packed away her old life. She decided to stay in Ashgrove, renting the same house, choosing the same view each morning, grey sky, distant ocean, the desk standing in its place of honor. She didn't hear from Mr. Linden again, but every so often, when fog blanketed the town and the streetlights flickered, she would find a fresh triangle in circle drawn in condensation on her window. She'd wipe it away with a steady hand, no longer frightened. She understood now, some stories never truly end, but what matters is who tells them and how. In her final article about the ordeal, she wrote, "History is not a prison unless we let it be. What we lock away becomes someone else's burden. What we open, what we name, what we share, that is where healing begins." Her life no longer felt paused, it felt chosen. And as the sun broke through the clouds one bright morning, she sat at the vintage desk, a blank page before her, and let the words flow. Not from fear, not from silence, but from hope. If this story kept you turning pages, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another mystery uncovered. And for your next journey into the unknown, click the video suggested on your screen right now. There's always another secret waiting to be found, and together we'll be the ones to open the drawer.